I have visited glorious gardens all over the world. And I've made gardens and gardened all my life. In fact, gardening is as essential to me as the air that I breathe. But I feel now the time has come when I want to explore my own country and discover just why we British are a nation of such passionate garden lovers. Whether it's a big garden where fantasies are indulged, or a small plot where dreams are made.
You're clearly good at it. That's
I'm lucky. I'm just lucky. It's the love, isn't it?
So many of us feel impelled to make a garden, and we'll find a way of creating one wherever we are. I want to find out what this tells us about ourselves. Is it just a particular aspect of our history, our climate, or some part of our national character that has made us a nation of garden lovers?
Is that nice?
They're so juicy and sweet.
So for over a year, I've crisscrossed the entire country, visiting as many gardens as possible. And on that journey, I've discovered new and exciting gardens. Look at that. Gosh. Gardens that are having to adapt to the changing climate, as well as gardens that are distinctly quirky.
Drapery are the raisins and sultanas and even the currants of a Christmas pudding mixture.
And all along, I've tried to define what makes a truly British garden. And in fact, is there such a thing? I'm beginning this programme in the Lake District. I'll be working south and then crossing over to Northern Ireland, coming back to the mainland, and then travelling right across the north of England from garden to garden. This is the second of 5 journeys I'm making right across Britain, starting from the northwest of Scotland and travelling all the way down to the tip of Cornwall. The journey will take me through some of the most beautiful countryside in Britain, from the dramatic landscape of the Lake District to the stunning coastline of Northern Ireland, and then right over to the North York Moors. My first stop on this 1,000-mile journey is Lowther Castle, near Penrith in Cumbria. This used to be one of the great houses of the area, surrounded by an equally magnificent garden. But in time, both house and garden fell into complete neglect, disrepair, and abandonment. But the garden is now being lovingly and ambitiously restored. And it's not just surrounding the building, it's actually running in and through it, too. Lowther Castle was built at the beginning of the 19th century by the first Earl of Lonsdale. It was huge, said to have a room for every day of the year. But just 130 years after it was built, it was abandoned and left to become a ruin. The estate has been in the hands of the Lowther family since the 12th century, and the current owner, Jim Lowther, mountaineer and explorer, took over in 2006. It seems incredible that this was relatively recently a grand house. What's the story behind that?
Basically, tax and the decline of the family fortunes after the First World War. By the time the last inhabitant of this place, who was my great-great-uncle, the 5th Earl of Lonsdale, died in 1944, there were huge tax bills.
The 5th Earl of Lonsdale, known as the Yellow Earl, was a popular sportsman and adventurer, and he was hugely extravagant, collecting Rolls Royces, all yellow, and even bought his dogs their own carriage. But by the time he died, he had squandered the family fortunes, abandoned Lowther Castle, and left huge debts. To pay the Yellow Earl's bills, contents of the castle were sold off by his brother, the 6th Earl. And when Jim's father, the 7th Earl, inherited the castle, it was an empty shell, and he loathed the place as a symbol of decadence and wanted to obliterate everything it stood for.
My dad took one look at this big empty building, because everything inside it had been sold, and it had a leaky roof. So we took the decision to take the roof off. No sooner had the roof come down that he put a pig farm inside here.
Yeah.
And then on the lawns, he put intensive chicken sheds. And then the gardens themselves, which are about 120 acres, he overplanted it with Sitka spruce trees and with acers and such like. Literally 2 weeks after he died in 2006, I got the bulldozers in and started bulldozing all the chicken sheds away. And then the rest is kind of recent history.
The rest, as Jim says, began in 2008, when he commissioned the landscape designer Dan Pearson to create a new garden around and inside the ruins. Out in the front, there is a yew parterre, interplanted with herbaceous perennials and grasses, creating a tapestry of soft colour. Within the ruins, Dan planted a garden that seems to have taken up residence inside the skeleton of the castle and given it a new and incredibly romantic life. Cladding the bare stone walls and furnishing the gutted rooms, creating a beautiful dreamlike inversion of garden and building. But Jim's plans reach out far beyond the ruins of the castle. He's only halfway into a 20-year master plan to renew the gardens right across the estate. And this includes excavating the huge Edwardian rock garden that had disappeared under his father's tree planting, but is now being lovingly restored.
What's your role in contributing to the life of this place? How does that square with what your father did and previous generation?
I'm quite powerfully motivated to do something positive with it, because my dad was powerfully motivated to destroy it.
What strikes me most about this place is that normally we come to a grand house or castle and look at its gardens as a kind of history lesson. What you feel coming here is that you're in the middle of something becoming into being. It's as though it's a new garden, a new place, reinventing itself on the bones of the past.
Leaving Lava, I'm going south through the magnificently rugged fells of the Lake District, heading towards Lake Windermere, to visit a garden that's actually quite small, but it has had a huge influence on generations of adults and children, and is still known in some form or other by millions of people across the world. Lake Windermere is England's largest lake, and I need to get round to the other side. Thankfully, there is a ferry that will take people and cars across in just a few minutes. A couple of miles inland from the lake's western shore, and I arrive at the village of Near Sorey, which was the home of one of Britain's best-loved children's writers.
Beatrix Potter spent most of her time living in this white house here across the valley. But that's not what I've come to visit, because the place that was really important to her was a cottage called Hilltop, just here on the other side of the valley. And that's where she originally bought as a holiday home. She never lived in it as her full-time home, but it was where she worked and where she wrote many of her books.
Beatrix Potter was born into a middle-class family in London, but spent her childhood holidays in the Lake District, and it was there that she developed a fascination with animals and a deep love of the area. In 1905, at the age of 39, she bought Hilltop Farm and became a prominent member of the farming community, as well as a highly successful businesswoman. The money for Hilltop came from her first book, The Tale of Peter Rabbit. And in the following years, some of the most enduringly successful children's stories of all time were to follow. Beatrix Potter used Hilltop as a setting for many of her illustrations, and this gate is still recognisably the same one that Jemima Puddle Duck set forth from, watched by kittens sitting on this wall.
The path leading up to the cottage also featured in many of Beatrix Potter's tales. And it's now flanked by informal beds creating a lovely loose jumble of flower. Directly in front of the farmhouse is the vegetable garden, accessed by another very familiar gate. Pete Tasker is a senior gardener at the National Trust and has worked here at Hilltop for 35 years.
Pete, obviously gardening here comes with its own complexities because people arrive expecting to see certain things.
Yeah, it's very true. And they expect a garden which is quite immaculate, quite tidy, but what they get is a garden which is slightly unkempt. It was never designed to be a really nice, perfect garden. But she wasn't a gardener. No. She'd never done any gardening before she came here.
Do you have a record of what she grew? I mean, did she keep notes?
We don't. And we have the little illustrations in the books, which may or may not have been based on real life. And we have some photographs that her father took when she was here in the early 1900s. But apart from that, the planting that we do is basically stuff that was available in her time.
When visitors come here, what's the most common question? What do they expect?
They ask me if I'm Mr. McGregor.
Do they?
Yeah. Yeah, and depending on who they are, I give them a different answer. If they're small children, I say, yes, I am.
What's particularly interesting to me about this garden is that not only does it recreate what Beatrix Potter would have done, and in some ways with a kind of honesty of not trying to be perfect that is surprising, but it also recreates the archetypal cottage garden. And remember, a cottage garden arose out of lack of space, lack of plants, and people growing vegetables and flowers and fruit all in the same space, jumbled up together without a plan. And that's what this garden has. So it's not just a slice of Beatrix Potter's life, but actually it's a picture of what hundreds of thousands of gardens would have been like 100 or 200 years ago.
From Lake Windermere, I'm now heading south. Once I leave Cumbria, I'm going to cross over the Irish Sea to Northern Ireland to see how its climate and politics have influenced its gardens. After which, I will visit a new and hugely popular public space in Manchester. I'll then work my way across Yorkshire before heading back south to finish this trip at one of England's great historic houses in Derbyshire. The places I visit will include an encounter with a truly British gardening obsession at a highly competitive gooseberry fair, and a famous Northern Irish garden that I've wanted to visit for years, but I discover is facing possible destruction.
Where we are sitting now could be under seawater.
At a high tide, yes.
Wow.
But before all that, I have one more garden to see here in the Lake District.
I've come south to a garden just outside Kendal. Now, this is one I've been to a number of times before. In fact, it's one of my favourite gardens. And although I first visited it over 30 years ago, I can be pretty sure that it won't have changed significantly.
Levens Hall is the oldest surviving garden in Britain, dating back to the 1690s. And where every other 17th century garden has either disappeared or been dramatically altered, Levens has remained largely unchanged for over 300 years. Its crowning glory is the incredible topiary garden, which sits in borders filled with thousands of bedding plants, all grown from seed in the garden itself. I caught up with Chris Crowder, Levens' head gardener, and incidentally, only the 10th to occupy that post since it was created. And with that role comes the delicate work of renewing parts of the garden while still preserving its history.
Chris, I've never forgotten that when we first met over 30 years ago,
You said something to me, which is that this garden could be recreated in about 30 years. And that means that for the last 300 years, effectively, it's been held in place. Is that still true?
I still believe that, and I've been planting new topiary to add to the burden of future generations. And these new pieces are now established and taking their place in the garden. But a lot of the older pieces, it is about attempting to hold that picture together. The bedding evolves much quicker. Yeah. The topiary is evolving, but in our human life scale, we don't notice it so much. But this we can change twice a year, every year, and we can have fun with it.
Is it just simply appearance, or are you thinking about the effect on the environment and the ecology and so on and so forth?
I'm certainly thinking about the effect on the ecology. I'm also an enthusiastic beekeeper, and half of my amusement really is planting the beds for pollinators, for my bees and for all the wild pollinators as well.
Chris, this is different to when I last came here. Is this a new...
Different and the same. This particular quarter of the garden, and it's all formally laid out as quarters, this has always been the orchard, so it's still got the old apple trees and the medlars. But instead of having borders delineating the path through here of shrubs and herbaceous plants, we pulled all those out a few years ago and planted up with a wildflower or an old-fashioned flower mix. These are annuals.
And why did you do that?
To give a different feel, I think, for this area, and because I think there's this feeling towards making places more natural.
I think this new, more natural and yet exuberant planting sits well within the historical structure of the garden. Like so many large British gardens, much of the work is done by enthusiastic volunteers. Beyond the orchard is the original bowling green, still in use, albeit by the local croquet club, who pay their rent by maintaining the grass, keeping the garden used and alive, and saving Chris, his team, and the volunteers a lot of work.
What do you think the ingredients of a typical English or British garden are?
That's an interesting one. I could say everything. This garden's got hedges, borders, grass, has to look right, and enough manicuring in certain parts of it that it looks cared for. I think it's that mix of the formality, the manicured elements, and the wilder, more romantic parts that make the British garden especially British.
The secret of preserving Levens as one of our truly great historic gardens is that it is adaptable, and in fact does change a little all the time, but very subtly.
The addition of these bee borders is inspiring and beautiful, and it does show that you can have a garden with deep historic roots that are very carefully curated and looked after, but at the same time is open to adaptation and change. Maybe that is the essence of a British garden, is one that honours its history, is aware of what's going on in the present, and also looking to the future.
It's a new day, and I've crossed the Irish Sea over to Northern Ireland. And now I'm on my way to the Holy Lands area of South Belfast. This is made up of rows of Victorian terraced houses and was originally a working-class Protestant area. But today, like much of the city, the community is becoming much more diverse.
Belfast is, of course, the British city with the most troubled modern past. But it is rebuilding itself, it's recasting itself, and that isn't happening just from top down. At street level, people are doing quite a lot of things to make life better. And I come to visit a project which is transforming their lives by using plants literally at street level. Wildflower Alley.
This is Wildflower Alley, and is one of scores of shared alleyways that run behind the terraces of the Holy Lands.
Ah, hello. I'm looking for Breege.
Yes, that's myself.
Oh, that's good. Hello.
Very
Hello, I'm
pleased to
Monty.
meet you.
This looks incredible.
It
This is not what I expected to see at all, especially coming around the corner there.
It is incredible. It's Narnia. This is a little haven of peace and greenery. This alley runs behind 3 streets, College Park Avenue, Rugby Road, and University Avenue. It was literally a dumping ground. There was drug dealing. There was a high level of robbery and crime. So we lobbied for alley gates to stop all of that. And when we got the alley gates in, we kind of looked around and thought this was a lot of reclaimed urban land.
Once the alley gates were installed, Breege and her neighbours set about transforming it into a flowing, seamless medley of individual gardens that together become a joyous communal space. Everyone has been given the freedom and inspiration to play. And the result is a richly decorated, flower-filled, safe space.
Does each section get looked after by the garden owner,
Yes.
the house owner?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, so it's all quite different, and that's a very
So
good thing.
we're very used to the idea of front gardens, and then you have back gardens, but these are back gardens, aren't
Back
they?
gardens,
Yeah.
yes. An extension of the whole community, and it really has brought 3 streets together in a really surprising way.
Why do you think people feel the need to bring plants into a space like this?
What people tell us is it gives calm. As somebody said to us, I get my head showered. It's a Belfast expression. I get my head showered when I come and sit here.
Wildflower Alley has been an inspiration to spread this transformation of the unloved alleyways in Belfast. I visited another similar project, bringing residents and their friends and family together in the north of the city, which Martina O'Toole and her neighbours began during lockdown, with a particular focus on growing edible produce.
It looks great. This is like Chelsea Flower Show. It's like show gardens. And then this one, look at the rhubarb, cabbage, and an apple tree in the corner
Apple
there.
tree. This apple tree has done fantastic this year. Although the apples are small, I love to see them.
I bet the children love all this. I bet they love to see it all growing, and the apples and the
Yes.
cucumbers and the strawberries.
The kids do. The kids like to come along, nibble sometimes, take a wee bite out of it,
Do they?
say what they like and they don't like. Yes.
I mean, this seems to me a good symbol of new Belfast, of the future, rather
Yes.
than the past.
Now, you know, it doesn't, we don't know who, you know, what religion, what background you're from. Anyone's visiting here, it's first and foremost about the gardening side of it, the seeing what is on the doorstep and they're just coming together with common interest, you know, whether it is planting or just looking at the flowers or picking some fruit or veg.
Yeah. Thank you.
It's inspiring to see the impact that gardens can have on whole communities. I'm now travelling north along the coast to see how a revamped garden can attract a growing audience of garden lovers. This is Glenarm Castle on the North Antrim coast. There's been a castle here since 1636, but the Victorian walled kitchen garden has been newly designed, specifically as a public garden to draw in visitors. The new layout is divided into a series of rooms, with ornamental fruit trees, neatly clipped hedges, and exceptionally lush lawns. And the whole thing covering an area of 5 acres within the walls.
I have to confess that my strongest reaction, certainly initially, is not about the design or the history or the choice of plants, but just simply the green. Because at a time when so many of us are either cutting back on our lawns or getting rid of them completely and growing longer grass and thinking about watering and the environment and pollinators.
Here, with a guaranteed high rainfall, they have embraced the opportunity to have masses of wonderfully verdant grass. From yew circles and neatly clipped beech hedges to pleached limes, whose bare trunks rise like colonnades, this garden is a masterclass in using texture and form in overlapping layers of green.
Around the outside of the walls are herbaceous borders of various colour schemes. So obviously this is soft pinks and yellows. And then on the other side, we've got very hot borders. And actually, probably that would have been the case in the original 19th century wall garden. You have borders around the outside and then fruit and vegetables in the middle, and so they've recreated that. And you get this ribbon of colour running right round the garden.
Although the design is modern, it's maintained some of the historical features, like the circular herb garden and the espaliered apple trees and ornamental pear garden, which all give a nod to the garden's productive past. But it's constantly evolving under the watchful eye of the garden consultant Neil Porteous.
My brief is really to try and bring in more exotic plants, which will be of interest to gardeners.
I'm assuming from that that it's a good place to grow exotic plants, is it?
It is, because we've got the sea right there, so we've got the Gulf Stream, so we don't actually get very cold winters.
But humidity you do have.
Oh, big time, yeah.
And is that wet a problem, or do you just go with it?
Actually, because we're on a very light, sandy soil,
Yeah.
even when, you know, in the summer, we get very heavy dews, which keeps the plants growing.
Yeah.
So it's almost like being in a bit of a cloud forest. Gardening is really sort of getting into vogue in Ireland generally, in both north and south.
Yeah.
But also, people are much more interested in the weird and the wonderful.
This part of Ireland may be encouragingly temperate, but it's not immune to the effects of climate change. And I'm now driving to a very famous garden south of Belfast, where the changing weather threatens its very survival. It's called Mount Stewart, and it's here by Strangford Lough. And the loch gives it a special microclimate, which means that not only is it very beautiful, but also it has a wonderful collection of plants. It's a plantsman's paradise. The garden is set in 70 acres of glorious woodland. The estate belonged to Edith Helen, Lady Londonderry. She was a suffragist and during the First World War formed the Women's Legion. Then, in the 1920s, she came to Mount Stewart and began to create the garden here, personally involved in every aspect, every plant. And this involvement continued to her death in 1959. The result are a series of very different areas, each with a distinctive character and planting scheme. At the back of the house is the Italian garden, laid out in formal symmetrical beds.
The two areas of planting mirror each other in structure, but not in colour. They're both based around a circular pool, and on the left-hand side, you have the colours of the rising sun. Pinks, rosy colours, flowing out into oranges as the day dawns. And then on the right-hand side, sunset. So rich purples and burgundies and oranges as the sun sinks down. And always this obsession with plants. She just could not resist plants and loved them and had to have as many as she possibly could.
Around the edge of the Italian garden, Edith installed seemingly classical stone pillars. But in fact, they're made from concrete to her own design with monkeys on their heads. She added a wide and eclectic range of trees into the garden that she collected from all over the world, including Northophagus, the southern beech from Chile, bananas from Japan, and Trachycarpus from China, all mixed in with the existing indigenous trees like oak and beech.
As well as loving the great diversity of plants, Edith focused in on a few that she had an absolute passion for, and lilies were one of them. She grew thousands of them. And what's so fascinating is to see how that they're growing underneath the woodland trees as a woodland plant rather than as a special exotic specimen. And of course, that is how they grow naturally, but I don't think I've ever seen it in a British garden before.
Mike Buffin is the head gardener at Mount Stewart.
Did she have an unlimited budget?
No, there are constant references in letters between her and her husband about
in June she'd overspent the budget already, and he was constantly trying to curtail how much money she spent on the garden. I don't think that message ever got through. She changed areas of the garden constantly. So what we do is we garden in her style, in her spirit, and there are some areas of the gardens where we would probably replace like for like. But in the situation that most gardeners face today, which is the challenge of gardening under climate change, then what we will do is we'll look at something that may be a bit more resilient.
Because Edith loved plants and bought more and more, she extended the garden beyond its natural borders, and now it's at risk.
We're a garden right on the edge of Stramford Loch. Sea level rise brings seawater at some point in the next 100 years into the garden, and certainly the lowest lying areas of the gardens, like where we are now.
You're saying that sometime in the next 100 years, where we are sitting now could be under seawater?
At a high tide, yes.
Wow. Are you planning to do anything about that? Can you do anything about that?
So what we started to do is to catalogue all of the plant collection in this area of the garden and then find a safe haven for it on higher ground. So we'll move the garden slowly up.
Do you have a place in mind?
So the current area that we've identified is the walled garden, which is at the very top of the garden, and an oave with an amazing view over Stramford Loch.
Well, I think there could be no more stark example of how climate change is going to radically change some of our gardens, and not just this one. After my all too brief visit to Northern Ireland, I've come back to England and Manchester, where the city has gone out of its way to repurpose what was an abandoned wasteland. This used to be an industrial site next to a motorway with an old railway depot. But now Mayfield Park has been redeveloped on the banks of the River Medlock.
Rivers, until very recently, were effectively drains in big cities, particularly a city like Manchester, with so many factories that would back onto it, use the water, and then discharge all their waste, however toxic, back into the river. And for that reason, until very recently, rivers have tended to be either filled in or ignored as part of any kind of green development. Not that there has been much, but they were determined to make it an essential part of the park. And by cleaning it up and protecting it, not only have they added to the attraction for human users, but of course it's a magnet for wildlife.
So despite being slap in the middle of this busy, noisy city, there are open spaces for play, and the park is designed and planted to look as natural as possible, providing real ecological diversity. The area's industrial past is reflected via the play towers resembling factory chimneys and steel girders scattered around the site without being intrusive.
I really like the fact that this was a brownfield site of printing works. It was a railway siding, and you've got the river running through it. And it's combined all that to make something that people obviously love. They're using it. Everyone is looking happy. They enjoy being here. And the fact that we've got a really busy road on one side and sirens and noise and buildings at one end and a railway at the other, I think is all part of the picture. This is in the center of a busy city, and it's an oasis. And it works.
I'm crossing the wild and wonderful Peak District National Park to take me across the county border from Lancashire into Yorkshire. I've come to Bramblewood Cottage in the village of Bradfield, just outside Sheffield, to visit the home of one of the leading pioneers in climate-resilient gardening. Professor Nigel Dunnett has worked on major public projects, including the Olympic Park.
Hello, Nigel. Hello, welcome.
And he's offered to show me how he's tackling the vagaries of our new climate on a domestic scale.
This is fantastic. It's so lush. Now, is that down to the rainfall you have?
Partly, we've had a lot of rainfall over the last month, but actually this is quite a special area because it's a rain garden. It's designed to capture and store all the runoff that comes off the house. And one of the first things that I did when we moved here, I thought very bravely, was actually to cut through the downpipe that comes off the roof of the house, add some additional bits of pipe onto it, take it underneath the path through the planting, and all the water that hits the roof empties into the garden, and it just soaks down slowly.
And you're planting into it?
The whole point is the water can just infiltrate and go down. So they capture the water, but they don't keep it.
And the environmental virtue of that is it stops it running away and causing flooding and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So are you having to exclusively use bog plants for this man-made puddle?
Well, we have a mix, so I can see ligularias here, which obviously like it wet. The astilbes, this beautiful astilbe purple lance. But there are other things in here. There are cosmias, which like it not so wet.
Yeah.
There has to be that balance of things which will tolerate it being a bit drier at times, but also plants like astilbes that will be quite happy when the water comes in there.
As well as creating rainwater ditches that he can plant into, Nigel mixes native and non-native plants for a good diversity of climate-resilient species, which also attracts a wider range of insects. It may look all very natural and wild, but is actually the result of Nigel's very skillful planning and curation.
What are the biggest problems, do you think, facing us as a result of climate change, in our gardens specifically?
Unpredictability. You cannot really plan for the future, I think. So having that diversity of things means that in one year, some things will do better, in another year, other things will do better. Having resilience, I think, to allow things to bounce back.
Not only are there a wide range of plants which encourage insects, but there are also lots of log piles arranged into berms.
Nigel cleared the site, which was covered in sycamores. He had an awful lot of logs and he stacked them up. They became very good habitat for mammals and insects and even plants. And that really proves 2 points, is that it's quite possible to do the right thing for nature and for the environment, but at the same time, do something that looks beautiful.
I've now come further north, a few miles beyond York, to visit a garden I've heard a lot about. So I'm expecting grandeur of scale, huge variety, and, to be honest, some English eccentricity. Breezy Knees is one of the largest gardens that's open to the public in the north of England. It covers a huge area, some 20 acres, yet it was created in the last couple of decades from an agricultural field in the middle of nowhere with no house attached. And all this is the brainchild of Colin and Mary Lynn Parker.
I suppose I have to begin at the beginning. Did you sit down one day and say, let's make a 20-acre garden?
No.
So what happened? Why?
Midlife crisis. Seriously, yeah, well, you know, joking, but you get to a point in your life where you just think, you want to do what you want to do, and you want to do what you enjoy doing.
What were you doing?
I was a pharmacist,
Right.
and we had pharmacies.
We worked together.
Right.
So we've always worked together,
that's
even
good.
through all of this.
Yeah.
I love the even through all of this.
Even through all of this, yeah.
Since
Were you living here, or did you buy this as part of the crisis?
No, this was it was actually, the land was, this was all arable farmland. It was a council tenanted farm. The council sold it off into different plots. We bought the biggest plot, and then we set about putting in, well, trees, hedges, because the reason we got our name is because we would leave home in the morning. Invariably, it'd be nice and calm and still at home. You get over here, and it was always windy, and that's because there were no trees.
But once a shelter belt was established, they could then begin the work on the garden itself, although that involved spending the first 8 years just preparing the ground. But now there are areas or separate gardens covering almost every horticultural style and planted with over 7,000 different varieties of plants. Colin is the passionate plant lover, whilst Mary Lem is the business brain.
it's very extreme. What brought you to this?
Well, I don't know where to stop. Marilyn knows where to stop, but I don't know where to stop.
Have to rein him in sometimes.
Yeah.
Right. So what would he do without you?
Actually, I don't know.
Neither do I, to be quite honest.
Over the years, I've met lots of men and women who have an intense passion for one group of plants, amounting to obsession. But I don't think I've ever come across a garden where that intensity of passion for plants has expressed itself in such quantity or diversity. And I think that's the driving force of this garden. I think it's all about Colin's insatiable love for plants. And the telling moment was when he said to me, the great thing about this garden is it's big enough to have any plant I want. And it's like a child in a sweetie shop.
From the lush Vale of York, I'm taking myself back to a part of the country that has special associations for me. These are the North York Moors, and long ago, I learnt to love them.
I came here in 1979, 44 years ago now, with my wife, Sarah, but she wasn't my wife then. We were running away, and we came to spend the winter from September till April, and believe you me, that is winter up in this part of the world, in a small building on the edge of the moor. And it was a magical, quite tough, but completely seminal part of my life. And so whenever I return here, it feels in a funny way like returning home. There's a little piece of me that's always up here on the moors. I now want to take you to a particularly British event, which I think captures that particular combination of passion and eccentricity that lies at the heart of the British love of gardening and growing things.
Today is the first Tuesday in August, and since the year 1800, that's the day the Egton Bridge Old Gooseberry Society hold their annual competition to find the heaviest gooseberry. Gooseberry shows were once common all over the north of England, but Egton Bridge is now only one of 2 societies left in the whole country. Nevertheless, the entrants come from far and wide.
This is my first year.
Is it?
First year showing.
Do you have to tend these with extra loving care?
Yeah, about 3 weeks before the show time, we put the golf umbrellas over them so that it keeps the sun and the rain off them. I'm just disappointed there isn't enough.
To be champion, you only need one, don't you?
Oh, yes, yes.
So how long have you been doing this?
About 5 or 6 years now. The problem is getting the guys who've been doing it for years, the world champion, Graham Watson, the heaviest berry, is getting them to give you any advice. I only found out with the sports umbrellas last year.
Of course he's not going to tell you,
no,
is he?
Of course he's not. No, absolutely.
The heaviest gooseberry is determined by an apothecary scale using traditional units. That's to say drams and grains.
Give it the benefit of the doubt and go 1?
I'd go 1, yeah.
Yeah? 8. 0, 1.
And judging is a very serious business.
So do you find that the smaller the berry, the slightly more leeway you or slightly less trouble you take?
No.
Or is that a terrible thing to suggest?
It is really, it has to be the way it is, Monty.
Yeah, no, I take it back. Of course, it was an outrageous thing to even...
Previous record winners have weighed in at 33 drams. But in 2019, a new record was set by world champion Graham Watson at the astounding 36 drams, 12 grains, which is heavier than a golf ball. So I wanted to know the secrets of Graham's world-beating gooseberry.
Now, Graham, you're world champion, aren't you?
Yes, for my troubles.
Tell me, as a gardener, what do you do to make you so consistently successful?
It's like anything, it's just paying attention to detail, really.
In what way? I mean, what sort of detail?
Well, it's the culture. It's getting the right varieties to start with. It's the growing. I love I'm a grower. I class myself as a grower. I love the process of growing.
Right. And do you eat gooseberries?
Yes. Yeah, we have a crumble every year. Yes.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. It's got to be done.
And do you eat the prize ones or the smaller ones?
Tends to be the smaller ones.
Yeah.
The other thing we do as well is make gin with them.
Do you?
Yeah.
I didn't know there was gooseberry gin. Is it good?
Oh, it's excellent. It's just like Sauvignon Blanc. It's lovely.
Right.
In the end, though, the only thing that matters was who has the heaviest gooseberry. Well, I was soon to find out, because I was asked to give out the prizes.
The heaviest berry was a white. It was a Belmarsh, 29 grams and 5 grains. And the winner, Mr. Graham Watson.
There you go, Graham. Congratulations. Stop there.
Whether it's the longest carrots, the largest pumpkins, or, as in this case, the heaviest gooseberry, I don't think you'll find this dedication, bordering on obsession, anywhere else in the world.
And the competition, it's intense and it's deadly serious, but always in this spirit of people sharing the moment. And that's still a really important part of British gardening.
From Egton Bridge, I'm leaving the moors, as ever, with regret. To visit a garden which has had a major influence on British garden design and planting, particularly wall gardens like the one at Glen Arm, ever since it was made nearly a quarter of a century ago. It is the walled garden of Scampston Hall, near Malton, just south of the moors.
This is the potager at Scampston. A 4-acre wall garden for a big house was geared very intensively to produce masses of delicious seasonal fruit, vegetables and herbs for the household. But then, like so many wall gardens, it was abandoned, fell into disarray and was largely ignored until 1997, when the Dutch garden designer Piet Oldhoff was called in to transform it, which he did.
And the result is this: a spectacular, inspirational modern design set within the 18th century walls of the original kitchen garden. The garden is divided into separate areas by beech hedges, each with its own theme. There's the serpentine garden, formed of undulating yew hedges, and the silent garden with 24 yew columns and a reflecting pool. And in the centre, at the heart of Pete's design, is the perennial meadow, with over 40 perennials and grasses planted in bold blocks around a central pond.
This was Piet Oldhoff's first British commission, and perhaps it took someone coming from abroad to see the potential of a wall garden, because we rather assumed that wall gardens were posh allotments, and so many were being underused, if they were used at all. Yet he came in, and within these walls has created an entire garden. We have fabulous borders. There are meadows, there's a mount, there are hedges, there are water features, there are his signature use of grasses and sculptural topiary. And we will see these signature plants and this way of gardening repeatedly as I travel around Britain, because the influence of this garden has been huge.
The garden is in the process of being restored to how Piet Oldhoff intended it to look, because over the years the hedges got too big, and the original lines of the design had become lost. As a result of the pandemic, the burden of the work fell to the newly arrived head gardener, Andy Karavich, and the owner, Miranda Ledgard.
Now, I gather you two came together as such, as a team during lockdown. Tell me how that happened.
I suppose I'd been here for 6 weeks, new job, excited to get going, and then lockdown happened. So we lost the majority of our team to furlough, and Miranda stepped in and started helping me in the garden.
And were you an experienced keen gardener?
Nope.
So what made you do that?
It was no gardener, or Andy was on his own.
And as a non-gardener, did you read it? Did you understand it?
Not at all.
No.
It was in at the deep end.
Right. And do you now?
Yeah, it was the best way of learning what the garden was about.
We've got what I think is the original plan here. To what extent were you aware you were dealing with, you know, a kind of monument?
I think it was very early on that we said, we want to honour this design. And because it had gone so far from its original design, the only way to bring it back was to go, right, let's go right back to the start, completely. You were chief raker, so I was hedge cutting, Miranda was behind raking.
Right.
So which is...
A real team.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was all glamour.
See, walking around it, you wouldn't know that you had done this sort of remedial work. It's responded very quickly.
Down to some pretty stupendous hedge cutting.
Right.
Since he designed this garden at the turn of the century, Piet Oldhoff has gone on to become world famous for his use of grasses mixed with perennials, creating great unbroken sweeps of colour. And of course, that is here in the perennial meadow.
But I also love the way in this garden that he's used the hedges, creating volume and blocks, and then gaps in between for which you can glimpse the planting. And that gives the garden a substance, a kind of heft, which I just think he's done brilliantly.
It's been fascinating to see an early work of such an influential designer. But I'm now coming to the end of this journey, which has taken me across the north of England and into Northern Ireland. However, I'm going back to Derbyshire and the Peak District because there's one more garden I want to see. This is Chatsworth, one of England's great historic houses.
Across the centuries, every generation has added to the gardens, and this one is no different, and I want to see what's new here.
The garden at Chatsworth has evolved over 500 years, but one of the biggest transformations took place in the 1840s under the 6th Duke and his head gardener, Joseph Paxton. Paxton designed the enormous Emperor Fountain and built the Great Conservatory, which was demolished in the 1920s. But there is a drive to revamp Paxton's areas of the garden, as well as create new ones.
So, where are you taking me?
So we're heading towards the rockery.
The garden designer Tom Stuart Smith has been commissioned to help with the latest transformations. The rockery, also designed by Paxton, is one of the areas that Tom has been working on.
I mean, just these stones as you enter. It is extraordinary because it's so gothically strange. That's the thing about it. It's not... It's almost nightmarish, actually.
Yeah, and I think something that people sometimes forget is this is an 1840s rock garden, so it's got nothing to do with you know, growing fancy plants from the Alps.
Yeah.
It's got to do with scene making.
Come on, let's have a look.
Paxton had huge gritstones stacked up to create his rock garden in the 1840s. But over time, it became neglected and overgrown. Tom has added to the original planting for a more natural effect, given the formerly straight path a gentle curve, and also added sandstone boulders to complement the original gritstones.
So all this planting is your work here, is it?
Yes, it is, yeah. But it's taken on a life of its own, which is a wonderful thing. So all these rocks here are ones that we added.
So you've added... Well, they fit in beautifully.
I mean, you can slightly tell the difference, can't you?
Yeah.
Because the sandstone is still a little bit yellower than the older stuff, which is grey.
Just the logistics, because I'm sure you had cranes and all the paraphernalia. To think in 1840.
Yeah.
Just incredible.
I mean, I kind of almost think that the Duke must have been away when they did it, you know, because he must have come back and thought, what have you done? I mean, this is just mad.
Tom then turned his attention to another part of the 100-acre garden. Above the maze, where Paxton's Great Conservatory once stood, He cleared trees from the wooded bank to create new vistas, and then planted on a massive scale.
So this is the great conservatory, the remnants of it with the maze. And the steps. Oh yes, look, what are they? There, you see, look at that. Gosh.
Everything in Chatsworth is on a grand scale, and this is certainly no exception. The new area of planting is on either side of these 100 steps that go up the hillside. This 15-acre area with its magnificent views is called Arcadia, perfectly in keeping with the spirit of a mythical, idyllic British landscape that name evokes. In order to create an impact on such a big landscape, Tom Stuart Smith and his team had to bring in nearly 250,000 plants.
Do you have hundreds of different kinds of plants that come through in waves?
So it does tend to happen in waves. It has a there'll be an early spring wave, which may be primulas and bulbs. Then there'll be an early summer thing. I mean, there are masses. There are about 1,000 Iris sibirica planted in this glade. I mean, the thing that gives it a bit of edge actually in this garden at the moment is the euphorbia, isn't it? Which just sort of, otherwise it would all be a bit too polite. And at any one moment in time, you don't want more than about sort of 3 or 4 things happening. And you want something which is an introduction to a great view, not a kind of complication in the view.
Final question, because I've asked it to everybody. I'm going around the country looking at British gardens. Do you think there is such a thing as a British garden? And if so, what defines it?
I don't really think there is. I think it's a really heterogeneous thing. And that's part of the wonderful thing about British gardens. You know, some gardens are very, very horticultural and plant-centred. Some are to do with climate change and ecology. Some are to do with connecting with nature and the landscape. I think there are, everybody's doing their own thing, and that's a wonderful place to be.
Thank you. Everything about Chatsworth is on a magnificent scale, so it's fitting that this new aspect of the garden is also on an enormous scale. Hundreds of thousands of plants, the biggest thing that's happened to the garden for over 150 years since Paxton. And it feels like a good place to end this trip around the north of the country. I've seen some staggering countryside as I've travelled over 1,000 miles from the Lake District across to Northern Ireland, to see brownfield sites in the middle of Manchester, and then in Yorkshire, gardens on rich lowlands, and of course competitive gooseberries high up on the North York moors.
And it's shown me that from back alleys to neglected castles or rain-soaked hillsides, across this country, if there's a space where we can garden, there are gardeners here who will turn these places into something extraordinary.
And although I've come to the end of this stage in the north of the country, join me next time as I travel across the middle of the UK, going from the far west coast in Wales to East Anglia.
On that journey, I visit a garden, although it's hard to believe today, that might well have remained a sports field.
These poor boys who had to give up cricket and rugby. Not a good deal, by the way, as a boy, I can tell you.
No.
In Nottingham, I meet people making their own personal haven on their allotments.
I live in the city centre in a high-rise block, and there's no garden on the 12th floor.
And I meet Britain's very first garden gnome.
Can I hold it? Is it valuable?
I think it's valued around £1 million.
No.
Your hand in mine, we've got the night and endless time. Whisper my name, soft gentle touch, my heart's aflame. Love you so much, and this love feels so right, lost in your eyes every night. No need to speak, just hold me tight. In this endless love's delight.